I've also wanted to write a novel about, but I'm a little bit intimidated of so doing, in Western New South Wales, not far from South Australia actually, near a town called Balranald, there is a lunette of sand and sort of cemented together sand, which once stood above a lake named Mungo, which was full of fish and was an epicenter for game birds. And there lived a concentrated population of Aboriginals. 30,000 years ago, 25,000 years ago. Mark that word, 30,000 years ago. Not 220 like us. We love this place. We are fascinated by this place after at most 10 generations. But the tower of generations of what we call prehistoric people who occupied this continent, imagine their attachment. And in a way, in that lunette of that vast ring that is like a crescent moon, there have been discovered 2 women who are one 29,000 years old, the other 28,000. And I've always wanted to write a novel about that woman or about either of them, because one of them had osteoarthritis of the shoulder, and this brings her right back to us in her face. I think of her as the auntie of Australia, because all our aunties had osteoarthritis. And a female cremation burial from 26,000 years ago, I'm sorry, I said 29, 26, that's so much more recent, was found at Lake Mungo in Western New South Wales. The light-boned woman's body was not totally consumed by flames when it was cremated on the beach of vast Lake Mungo, and the remaining bones were broken up and placed in a pit. Then half a kilometre distant, but some 2,000 years older, a body, so 28,000 years the older one, a body, almost certainly a woman's, her right shoulder badly afflicted with osteoarthritis, and her skin ornamented with red ochre, was found partly cremated and then buried. Both these people were Homo sapiens sapiens, and it is likely that their cosmology coincided in essentials with that of the Aboriginals, the first visiting Asians, the Macassars who landed up in Yolngu territory in northern Australia. It is likely that their cosmology coincided in essentials with that of the Aboriginals, the first visiting Asians and Europeans would encounter. So there is a failed novel. But here is a novel I tried to write, and I'm about to stop, David. I've taken longer than I intended. Here is a novel which I discovered, a subject I discovered and felt I could do as a novel because the subject was marginal enough to illuminate history without being the Emperor Justinian. You know, only Gore Vidal can pull off those books. You know, about emperors and presidents and so on. This concerns a Russian who existed, whom I've named Samsarov, but his real name was Artyom Sergeyev. and he escaped from Siberia and came to Russia with other escaped Tsarist prisoners. Now, I love, and I'm sure you do too, these perverse conjunctions between the old world and the new. To think of exiled Russians, admirers, some of them of Tolstoy, though my hero isn't, admirers of Maxim Gorky, performing in Russian the lower depths in South Brisbane. The fact that everyone seems to come from Brisbane. David Malouf, Kerensky's wife, and these blokes. And indeed, Artyom Sergeyev had a son whom, when Artyom was killed in a train smash in Russia in 1921, a demented man named Koba, who became known as Stalin, adopted. And he died just last year. He was a lieutenant general in the Russian army, the son of the man from Brisbane, so that there was only 2 degrees of separation between the Kremlin and Joe Jelke-Peterson. Well, this man, Artyom Sergeyev, who is Samsarov in my novel, and the great thing in a novel, you can do what you like. In history, you have to try to tell the truth by trying to tell the truth. In the novel, you try to tell the truth by telling divine lies. And there was a woman, lawyer in Melbourne, who was an early radical, a fascinating woman. And the interesting thing is, the bourgeois revolutionaries had a taste for self-educated, autodidactical, working-class lads, because they thought, he's been through it, in a way I haven't been through it. Fascinated with each other, and characteristically, Artyom falls in love with a young woman, lawyer, who works in the Attorney General's Department in Brisbane, and who is always stealing files when he's arrested. She just steals his file. And ultimately she's discovered and drummed out and all the rest of it. But I just brought her up from Melbourne so she could meet Artyom and have an affair with him. That's the sort of thing you can do in fiction, and it works. It works as long as, I don't know, it works as long as it is breathed upon by those hidden gods and demigods and maidens and Adonises who live in that secret valley, deeply unseen, deeply grooved in our brain. The novel, the experience of writing the novel, is to find out things you didn't know you knew, and the novel is my great love, because I am by nature a liar. Fortunately, the past does have an artistic form, but it is a bit boring telling the truth. Thank you.
Tom, I'm sure I'm talking for everyone here when I say I didn't want you to stop. So, so if I ask you a question, it's really to just encourage you to go on. What do you make of the difference between history and fiction, and I don't mean what's factual and what's not, but what's truthful and what's not. Because, as somebody who also has written novels that are set in another time, I would like to think that fiction tells us things which are truer than the things we can work out from the sequence of events or from what we think we need to know about character. And what I mean by that is that we are moved by irrational and dreamlike and myth-like things which don't appear in history, but which the novel can deal with.
Well, you can, you mess around with history without knowing you are messing around. I think the historian can't avoid herself, himself, and the construct that they are of beliefs and genes and familial tendencies. So I think of the historians as being different the way I think of history being like the icing in a cylinder on which our mothers used to screw a different nozzle. And sometimes it was a triangular nozzle, that one that when she punched the plunger down, the icing would come out triangular, or it could come out square, depending upon which nozzle she put on, or it could come out like a star. And I think historians are like that. History is all there, but the fictionalizing aspects of history, at which Manning Clark was so good. Manning Clark is a very different nozzle than Geoffrey Blainey. Geoffrey Blainey is a great historian, but because of his political beliefs, I was almost tempted to say that his novel is square. So there is inevitable, in the arrangement of material, in the selection of material and what you make of it, there is creativity. For example, I have at home a copy of a letter from Dickens's most successful son, Sir Henry Dickens, to the Australian son, one of the Australian sons, Edward Bulwer Lytton Dickens, over the £800 that were borrowed some years before to buy a share in a station on the Darling, and which the younger brother, Edward Bulwer Lytton, the Australian, did not repay. Now, you can just report that as there being a quarrel between the older brother and the younger brother being neglectful and being embarrassed about his debt and therefore not contacting his brother for 15 years. Or you can explain it in terms of the Australian environment. By the time the Dickens boys arrived, the remaining leases were out beyond the Darling. They were subject to the most severe realities of the Australian environment and to degradation brought upon the interior of Australia by the rabbit. You could write a history of Australia entirely from the point of view of the rabbit. And so you can see it as a personal conflict, or you can see it as in terms of the flaws of young Edward, or you can see it as an entire environmental tragedy and a failure of the Eurocentric view to adapt to the reality of what the rainfall is out there. And so they're just simply two examples of the way you can sort of fictionalize. You can be creative with what things mean. But it's not as good as the novel. The novel's the big game.
I don't want to hog any more of this. I'm sure there are people out there who want to ask Tom questions, which he'll be very ready to answer.
Tom, thank you very much for such an entertaining session. I was just interested in your comment about being intimidated that you made earlier on. I can't imagine you being intimidated by anything, and just wondered if there had been an intrepid moment. Perhaps, have you ever been seriously warned off and intimidated about raising any particular subject?
I have been intimidated into abandoning a subject, but it was a subject that wasn't going well, like The Dickens Boys as a novel. And it was the subject of Juanita Nielsen. And I had met with a journalist a number of times, and he knew that we had been observed, and I got 3 death threats. One Friday morning, I got a call from the Sun newspaper, now defunct, and the man said, I am the crime editor of the Sun, and I'll give you a number. You call me back so you know I am who I say I am. I called him back and he said, well, we've got just this message that there will be an attempt on your life today. Now, at that stage, you don't think, if they're going to warn me, they're not going to do it, because the best murders are always the ones that come by surprise. I thought, well, Juanita's not going so well. Poor Juanita. So I'll give it up. But I was partly influenced by the fact the novel was not going well. I was partly influenced by fear for my children, sincerely, but I was also partly influenced by cowardice.
Thank you for writing such enjoyable literature. A lot of people today, especially a lot of young people, are consuming their literature or their intake in smaller and smaller chunks, 140 characters, funny spellings, and things like that. I'm wondering how that future consumption of intake impacts you in your writing today, and what impact you see that would have on the novel in the future. Yet very, very interesting question. I think all novelists are affected by their milieu. I notice many novelists who are great novelists, you can see the influence of film upon the way they write, upon, in some cases, the length of chapters. But we are all creatures, as Marshall McLuhan said, of the media that surround us or drive us forward or have impact upon us. I am not, I'm beyond now being cool enough to be read by the young, but I am writing a novel at the moment which may come to nothing, and I've sworn to keep the chapters short, about 3.5 pages, and instead of explaining how people got from one place to another, to just drop them there and let the reader, who after all is intelligent, work out what the transition was. Okay, she caught a train, but you don't need to describe everyone who was in the carriage unless they're germane to her perception. It is a case of a her in this book. It's the story of a young nurse. So we are influenced by the fact that everything's become brisker, but not all of us are. I just met in that tent over there a wonderful writer called Sarah Waters. And she's in... David described me as old-fashioned, and he meant it as a compliment. And she's an old-fashioned novelist too, in that she takes her time. Very fine writer, shortlisted for the Booker, and I do recommend it to you. Wonderful book called The Night Watch. Don't buy this rubbish. Buy the Night Watch. So some of us try to adapt but we try to adapt as an exercise to see if we can do it. When you're a young writer, I don't know if David did this, but you try out writing like Hemingway, and then you try out writing like Thomas Mann, and then you try out writing like Patrick White, until you find your voice. And I'm doing this, honestly, more as a challenge, as an experiment, than, because I want to attract the attention of people on Facebook.
More questions? A last question, and then we need to finish.
I'll be brief.
Thank you for the most wonderful address. We've all enjoyed it tremendously. I met my husband interviewing him for a book about an eccentric vet, and he was a friend of this chap's. And we actually, after it was published, we got together, and in getting to know each other, he said, "You should write about my grandfather. He was eccentric. He used to smoke his cigars in a pipe, and talked about himself in the third person." And I was quite intrigued. Then he told me, as we got to know each other more and more, and we finally got married, the stories about his grandmother came out. And she's even wackier. So I thought, whoopee, here I go. And so I have started writing about them. And having read the first chapter to a group of friends, one of them came up to me after and said, yeah, it's great, but I'm not sure you should ghostwrite someone else's story. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think basically steal everything. Details like that are too rare to waste, even if they belong to another human being.